Mi nombre es José Ñáñez.
My name is Jose Ñañez. I thank Sensedia and Nicolas for having visited us in Colombia a few months ago. And today we will talk about open banking apps, and I am the corporate head of Open Bank and APIs of my bank. We will talk about 5 specific topics, which are open banking, as one of the key topics. Then we have data, which is the raw material of this issue. We also have regulations, and that's very important. And we have recommendations for the exposition of APIs and capacities, and the challenges and lections that we can get from an application. Let's move on to the first topic, which is open banking. What is open banking actually? It's an interesting question because we'll be addressing a few exercises that were done in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and recently in Brazil as well. But what does it mean? It's a capacity for offering and demanding, and that has a few particular characteristics. If you review specifically what those characteristics are, they are related to the market. And when you're talking about creating a market, we talk about who is offering things and who is demanding things. And what we start to see is a structure where we have fintech organizations, small businesses, fintechs, and at the same time we have the same type of company, and they are operating in consumption in this market. But we are moving a little bit into details. Just see the astonishment of this photo. When you're talking about open banking, people generally talk about openness, but that means controlled openness and consumption, because openness does not mean being exposed to threat. That means consuming capacities and the integration of new capacities and new functionalities in the companies, in the fintechs, and in the undertakings generate value to the organizations. And we prove that in another way. We have this financial capacity and also non-financial capacity. Usually we first of all think about transaction and financial capacity, but when we start enriching our offer of value with information that is not financial, these capacities allows us to understand our customer more assertively and more profoundly. And we should not forget about one of the most important points here, which is ensuring safety of those capacities. So if you review those 3 topics, what do we have? We have this controlled openness and consumption, and that does not mean expose consumers to consumption just for the consumption's sake. And we have financial and non-financial capacity. And another important point is ensuring the security or safety of that capacity or those capacities. Now we are seeing the initiatives over back in the world. If you have a look from left to right, we see the work that has been done so far, starting from the UK, and then we have the standardization industrial group in the United States back in 2017 with a similar trend, just like the pillars that we talked before. And here we move on to this data protection law, and SB2 is what is added to it, and new corporations start to show up that add value. And let's move on a little bit. In Mexico, the last year, open banking had a lot of people accessing the portal, and these people tried to understand. They started to understand a very clear trend. And open banking in Brazil, we had this initiative being opened in 2019. And what comes next? It's an interesting question, which is all about the creation of a market. Before, we had capacity that were exposed and which other people consumed. And whenever we had standardization and mobility, allowed actual people to create new products. Now we are talking about market components. First of all, and which everyone is aware of, is the people who are offering services. But what do they actually offer, and what are they offering that for? Well, they offer products, first of all, which meets a few needs for consumers, and we start to analyze the APIs as though they were a product, which sooner or later would establish market conditions. That does not mean that we have just one defined regulation or an imposed regulation, but this is a co-creation work that usually made between an industry or a supervisor and the regulator, or perhaps a body that is responsible for that in a certain country. And the last topic is value generation. It's one of the most challenging things. It's just not about offering value services, but you can quantify value in a number of companies, and that generates income, efficiency, and the market can be developed actually. And who takes part in the market is, I think that everyone sees yourselves in these. Like we have the corporation and small business startups, everyone is inserted in this market. Creating a market requires offer and demand of different business capacities. This all with the purpose of aligning efforts strategically that is inside of each of the business areas of an organization, so that they could build better APIs. So now let's get into the raw material, which is the data. So the raw material of data of the APIs is data, and data has basically 4 ways to be analyzed. The first way of analyzing data is internal data, and these data belong to the corporation or the company. So this data has a value that is very important because it's the company's assets. But what happens when we start talking about ecosystems, for instance, we start talking about external data that generally is not controlled by the organization. External data allows you to enrich business capacities, but now we have a very important topic to be discussed. So, data information could be unprocessed or processed. These are the 2 ways it can be presented, and we start analyzing information and process it so that we could build products that could be exposed through an API, because this way we eventually have a data product, and that generates a considerable high value if we just deliver one of the pieces of data which was raw or not analyzed data. Now let's move back to this part. So we have internal data, external data, and sources that allows us to enrich our business capacities, and processing could be done through our units or through third parties' units. And here we start talking about process like opening innovation. When you talk about how we can build apps that are supported in third parties applications, we touch the regulation topic. And this concept sometimes causes some fear in certain markets. We're not talking about financial services. That is something that is very normal. So let's have a look at the history of this situation. So back 2016, we have the Open Bank for GDPR. And 2018 we had PSD2, and this is the way we are following. What comes next? So regulation starts to look for some paradigms, but also an extent delimitation that could be reached or sought after by the company. So let's move back a little bit to this slide. When you talk about processed information that can be exposed as a product, then we have to understand the following. That should be part of the company's purpose, and this has to do with regulation in this case. So this is associated with regulation, and now we are talking about recommendations to expose those capacities. In this case, we have the APIs with interfaces. We have 5 aspects that are relevant. First one is analysis. We are talking about data, we are talking about market and who offers things. We are talking about customers. So where are we going to start from? And market analysis is one of the most interesting parts. When a financial entity or any other company that goes into a market, it has to analyze competitors, that market, who is offering products or services, who are the demanders of that sort of service. An interesting concept that the AP demanders are not people, like individuals. They are actually teams, development teams that need to meet certain needs to build new capacity that the markets are actually asking for. Now let's move on a little bit. If we analyze a certain market, then we have to analyze our assets as well. And they are related to information. So remember that information is not ours as a company, it's the customers. But we have access to that information with a prior consent of the customer so that we can run analysis, processes, and generate new capacities as well. And this has to do a lot with regulation. And this regulation varies according to the country. And the monetization of information would otherwise, regardless of each one of those clients' rights, and that is very important. Respecting those rights, respect to the information is very relevant to this. So GDPR structures a few principles. We are now moving back to the analysis of those capacities, and they are known as fortresses. What are the assets, and what are our strong points? We have competent teams that challenge those new definitions and develop the capacities that are needed for that market. This is a question that we have to ask ourselves. Can we deliver the information that the market is asking for?
Let's take a look at the last point, client analysis, the support teams. All these talks that you have been watching during the day talk about this experience. It's the one who takes the last decision whether to integrate or not against an API exposed by one company. Maybe it's a little fierce depending on the scenario. Different teams, especially in business, they feel a bit affected whenever they start understanding that the support team who provide the final recommendation and request how much API is to be consumed. In this reality, we are at a different market in which we work with that development that require the business and develop the business. These business capacities have a list of variables. These are three, or could be the most relevant. So let's cover each one of them. The first one, generation of value, strategic alignment, and this is of utmost importance. Picture you in all the people present here belong to a company, and in every 2 rows is a different business area, and there are support areas and areas of security and development. What if we're not aligned? If we don't think of a common goal? In many organizations, there can be problems related to development, and we can physically see we would have 3 groups of roles outlined. And this provides us a pace of work and freedom to straight talks. However, if we don't see ourselves as one, we'll start having problems. The strategic connections mean that all the units in the organization are conscious of their necessities and capacities they have. These exposed capacities are related to APIs due to a transition regulation or a definite regulation included in the market within a concept of open market. Let's move on to the last point. Performance through inversion. So it's to perform with a clear objective in business. The next point is inversion, which is so invert the development teams, the business teams and solution marketing teams and prevention strategies. And it's current market solutions. It's an interesting question. It's regardless of the strategy of organization. And in assessment of security, to perform a market investigation, this must be a consequence of the capacities included in the company and its actives and the data that they own. Let's move on to the last topic, the last variable of the 3 mentioned. Technological readiness in an organization. Whenever a platform is selected, a programming language is selected, a team is selected and capacitated, and think about a development program. If we don't have a platform selected and languages and teams and capacitated teams, the API implementation will be torturous and very extensive. It would have been a pretty presentation and interesting. However, it would not add value to the organization. Each one of the capacities and APIs that are developed have to generate value to the organization. And this value is normally aggregated to deficiencies or enrollments, and these are quantifiable. They affect the balance, and the generation of benefits to an organization is what allows you to build and move forward. If we look at one point of view, more regulatory, may it be regulatory or supervision in some countries, we must talk about a market of one market opening. So there may be new actors, and these actors may build different tools, solutions, applications over the capacities which are being developed by the company. Let's move on to the challenges and lessons learned in an application process. This sentence, many of you may know. I'll be reading it. My apologies for the presentation not being in Portuguese, but with the simultaneous translation, we should understand it correctly. The phrase was written by Lord Rothschild III, and it's the following. The bank activity consists essentially in facilitating the movement of money from point A, where it is, to point B, where it is necessary. So we move forward a little bit. This sentence was written last year. The organizational amplification consists essentially in facilitating the movement of data from point A, where they are, to point B, where they are necessary. Let's go back a little bit. So the money is represented by data. And it's been represented by data for a long time. The APIs is programming interfaces and application. It's been done for years and data and decades. And it's quite interesting to perform data movement. The APIs are vehicles in which we consume data or expose information. Now, let's move on to the challenges. It's nice to think about that the little kid will not reach the end. Yeah, you wonder whether yes or no. Strategic alignment. Many initiatives of implementation won't be successful as the alignment of different units have not been done. Efforts must be focused on both in team, business and technical teams, and these efforts must be shared. Organizations must understand that efforts and objectives are shared. It's not simply that teams fulfill their micro objectives. They have to keep in mind their corporate objectives. Is to understand them and focus on developing them. Determine whether there should be inverted to maximize income. Because on the other hand, you would have a percentage superior to 20% of the organization inverted in projects that would not generate any value at all. Prepare presentation correctly. Do you remember? Perform the technical preparation. It may take forever. It must be agile, that allow you to think, experiment, and get approval in the shortest time possible. Now, this is what allows you to evolve the core of the business. The APIs, when with the intention of profiting, must be defined within strategical planning, but not through the generation of expected value. Let's move on to the lessons learned. Structuring and conformation of a business unit which has a clear objective outlined and based on the business proposals set forward. Here we're talking about basically providing services. There has to be a structural base in the organization. The next point, assigning capacities as an autonomous structure and self-contained, as if autonomous is able to take decisions necessary aligned with the strategies within the organization. Remember, if you're creating a market, the quickest you are able to make decisions and establish capacities, the biggest impact you will cause in the market and the building and development of it. Because you must have the necessary components so you can develop yourself. On the contrary, many organizations, it's more paperwork and emails and meetings and chats, calls, and generation of value is low. Everybody in the room know very well when it comes to autonomy, and everybody worldwide have a similar structure, taking decisions and ensuring alignment of your different work teams in the most efficient way possible. The creation of short cycles focused on the value generation of value. In other words, understand the necessities of the market, create sandbox, perform tests, and ensure a business case and comply. Less is more. And as organizations are developing their capacities, the more they will see that it's important to generate value. It's not simply 100, 200, 300 APIs. It's not a number. It's the generation of value. There are already organizations around the world that have many millions of apps, and none of them generate value and produce benefits. I hope you have enjoyed the presentation. I thank you very much for the time. Thank you very much for your precious time. And I hope you have a great end of evening event.